Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a text that totally flips the mainstream historical narrative on its head. We're talking about Emmeline Pankhurst, the early suffragettes, and a staunch theological defense of biblical patriarchy. The author of our source material is bringing a major critique of modern history, really challenging how we think about power, gender, and ideology. We're going to break down exactly how this argument is built, step by step.
Here's the roadmap for how the author unpacks this. First up, the anchor and the drift. Second, militancy and covert power. Third, the white feather campaign. Fourth, horrors of the trenches. And finally, feminism versus biblical patriarchy. Let's jump right into Section 1, the anchor and the drift. This is where the author really lays down the foundational worldview for the whole text.
The text actually grounds its entire philosophical perspective in a biblical mandate. It points specifically to Ephesians 4:31, "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you." The author calls this the historical anchor, basically a mandate to reject destructive emotions. But the argument goes, modern ideology has experienced this massive cultural drift away from that anchor. According to the text, we've steadily replaced objective, biblically grounded truth with, subjective desires and emotional outrage.
Now, the source defines this ideological drift through a really fascinating gendered lens. It divides the abuse of power into two distinct camps. On one hand, you have the masculine heir. This is all about overt power, so physical force, visible dominance, externalized destruction. Because men generally have more physical strength, this kind of abuse is super obvious, right? Society spots it and condemns it easily. But on the flip side, the author identifies a feminine heir, driven by covert power. This involves weaponizing the default social sympathy that women receive, using ideological subversion and emotional manipulation. The text argues that this covert power is way harder to spot, but honestly just as devastating when it's unleashed.
All right, moving on to Section 2, militancy and covert power. The text uses some intense historical case studies to show us what this weaponized covert power actually looks like in practice.
The spotlight here is on Emmeline Pankhurst and the Women's Social and Political Union, or the WSPU. The author tracks how these early suffragettes escalated their militancy under the motto, "Deeds, not words." And we're not just talking about peaceful marches with signs here. By 1913, the movement was literally burning down the summer home of politician David Lloyd George, and a suffragette tragically lost her life at the famous Epsom Derby. Then, in 1914, there was even a near-miss hatchet attack on the Prime Minister in Dublin. The author really emphasizes that these women were using extreme physical violence, coordinated arson, firebombing mailboxes and churches, while essentially being shielded from the harshest consequences by the societal norms and privileges of their gender.
When these women did get locked up, they went on hunger strikes. The government's response? Brutal, agonizing force feeding. The public outrage over this was huge, and it led to the 1913 Cat and Mouse Act, which allowed starving prisoners to be temporarily released just to recover, only to be rearrested later. Now, to be clear, the source is definitely not defending the government's horrific force-feeding practices. But the author does claim that the suffragettes intentionally used this self-inflicted suffering. They knew it would exploit the conscience of a society that was, by its very nature, inclined to protect women.
And that brings us to the absolute crux of the author's historical critique. The text poses a really pointed rhetorical question. Had men starved themselves in protest? Would the public have even cared? Would they have been given a voice? The author's answer is a resounding no, arguing that the suffragettes explicitly capitalized on that natural social sympathy granted to women. They knew exactly what they were doing, using covert power to get this outsized political leverage that men of the same era, many of whom couldn't even vote themselves, just flat out didn't have.
So that takes us to Section 3, the white feather campaign. This is where the text shifts to the outbreak of World War I to highlight a much darker manifestation of this covert power. Before the draft kicked in 1916, Britain relied entirely on voluntary enlistment, and during this window, the white feather campaign took off. Women would walk right up to civilian men in public and hand them a white feather. This wasn't just a quirky gesture. It was a profound, socially devastating symbol of cowardice. According to our source, Emmeline Pankhurst and the suffragettes were all in on this, enthusiastically endorsing the campaign. The author argues they leveraged this immense, deeply psychological threat of sexual and social shame to basically coerce men into the military. The author points out a pretty crucial contrast here. Women actually had plenty of ways to voluntarily serve their country at the time. They could be nurses in the VADs or join auxiliary corps for the Army, Navy, and Air Force.
Yet, instead of putting themselves in the line of fire, the text argues many of these women chose to wield that covert power, manipulating men into deadly combat situations. The source notes this intense shaming was so effective, it drove boys as young as 14 to lie about their age just to enlist, and it completely destroyed the social standing of principled pacifists or men holding essential jobs back home.
To really contextualize the brutal consequences of all this shaming, we hit Section 4, Horrors of the Trenches.
The text pulls heavily from war poets who actually survived the slaughter, guys like Siegfried Sassoon. Listen to this. He crouched and flinched, dizzy with galloping fear, sick for escape, loathing the strangled horror and butchered frantic gestures of the dead. The author uses this to evoke the unimaginable suffocating terror of trench warfare. We're talking the mud, the artillery, the gas, and the butchered dead. The source argues that millions of men willingly walked into this literal hell, driven by a deeply ingrained, almost instinctual desire to protect the very women who were back home shaming them.
Then, through the haunting words of Wilfred Owen, who famously called the glory of dying for one's country the old lie, the author paints a really stark historical contrast. The source asserts that men earned their right to vote by paying a horrific, unimaginable toll in blood. But in contrast, the author argues that Emmeline Pankhurst and the suffragettes demanded and ultimately gained their political privileges through violent militancy, all without ever having to face the deadly, grueling responsibilities demanded of the very men they sent off to the trenches.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, Feminism versus Biblical Patriarchy. This is where the source synthesizes all these historical events into one massive cultural conclusion. The text does not mince words here. It asserts unequivocally that there is no such thing as moderate feminism. Period. The author claims the entire ideology is built on this false narrative of perpetual female victimhood, a narrative that intentionally pits the sexes against each other. By painting all men throughout history as oppressive villains and just completely ignoring their sacrifices, the author argues that feminism naturally breeds hostile, radical rhetoric and is fundamentally antithetical to Christian principles. The text wraps up by vigorously defending biblical patriarchy, pulling in a quote from preacher Vadi Baucham, "We are not ashamed of patriarchy. We believe it is biblical, we believe it is good, we believe it is right." The source completely tosses out modern egalitarianism and the whole feminist goal to smash the patriarchy. Instead, the author argues that biblical patriarchy is actually God's loving, established design. From this viewpoint, patriarchy isn't about men dominating or abusing women at all. It's about men bearing the weight of responsibility, leading their homes through sacrificial service, and literally dying to themselves for the sake of their families. Stepping back to look at the big picture, the author ultimately places Emmeline Pankhurst's militant feminism as just one rotten branch on a much larger tree of bad ideas. The text traces this genealogy straight from Marx's oppressor narratives and Nietzsche's claim that God is dead, right down to the idea that female violence is necessary to overthrow the patriarchy. It's framed not as a noble pursuit of justice, but as a dangerous, destructive ideological drift away from foundational truths.
We end this explainer with the author's ultimate provocation. Are we willing to look past the historical narratives we've just been handed our whole lives? Are we willing to recognize the profound, real-world difference between overt and covert power? It's a heavy question for sure, one that fundamentally challenges the cultural air we breathe today. But according to the author, it is a question we absolutely have to answer.